Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to this week's Q&A. I had a pretty cool trip to California. I was able to meet up with Smoke Monster and Mike Chi, and there's going to be videos about both of those as soon as I can get them up. Smoke Monster should be today-ish, I hope. It was a good trip. It was like a half vacation. I still had to work, but really enjoyed hanging out by the beach. I love San Diego, so who knows, maybe I'll be out there sometime. And I was out there for the earthquake. And maybe I'm crazy, and maybe this is a coincidence, but we're in the car driving to my brother's house, and I felt weird, like disoriented. And I immediately thought, like, it's just car sickness, even though I was looking straight ahead, and I don't usually get motion sick like that. And then we're at my brother's house, and we're standing in the kitchen, and I started to feel like worse, I guess. And to the point where I started thinking, man, I really hope I don't have to go lay down on my first day out in California. Like, it's not like me at all. I usually power through anything if I feel bad. And we sit down and we're having a beer, and it starts to get really bad, and all of a sudden, the whole house starts to shake. And I put a little video up on Instagram of that and everything. But is it a coincidence? Is it that I felt the earthquake coming? Because I've heard stories about, like, it changes the magnetic field right before an earthquake, and there's plenty of studies of how magnetic fields mess with your brain. So if any scientists out there, please let me know. Is it that it was all a really big coincidence? I just got off a 5.5-hour flight, was in a car for 45 minutes and was a little woozy, and then the adrenaline of the earthquake snapped me out of it? Or was it really that I felt an earthquake coming, and then when it was done, like the feeling left? I'm so curious about that stuff. I'm perfectly okay if the answer is no, you're fucking crazy. But it did absolutely happen like that, and could have very well been a coincidence. But any scientists out there, please let me know. I'd love to hear the explanation. But anyway, let's jump into the Q&As now that I'm back, and hopefully I didn't miss any last week, but let's see what we got. I'll start with the newest post first. Tofu Man found a Luva Connect ID 40-inch LCD TV from around 2013. So the brand Luva, I think it's a Connect ID is the model and the 40-inch LCD. And when he used the time sleuth on it, when it was in game mode, 480i registered just about the same amount of lag as 480p, which on modern TVs, meaning 2019, 2018, it's usually the opposite. Usually all 480i sources are just a ton more lag. And it's kind of interesting. I haven't really seen this before, but I also haven't really tested for it, and I never bothered testing 480i until I just got a time sleuth, a few months ago whenever the time sleuth came out. So that's a pretty interesting thing. If 480i on a flat screen is important to you and this looks okay, I mean, this seems like something to hold on to. Generally speaking, though, if someone has the ability to have a CRT, now I know not all of us do, it takes up a lot of space, whatever, but I would always recommend 480i on a CRT because the interlaced flicker is kind of a natural look of the CRT. It won't hurt your eyes more than just any other image on the CRT. Whereas, at least personally, I find that interlaced content on a flat screen never looks quite right. You get those interlacing lines when you're watching movies. If you do Bob de-interlacing, you get the flicker. And so that's kind of, that's just part one of that. But I guess if you were looking to play 480i on a flat screen, I'd like to look a little bit more into this TV. Maybe when you put it to game mode, it changes the de-interlacing method. Who knows? I mean, maybe Luva is certainly a company that went above and beyond with their CRTs. Their Aconda and Articos just blew me away as far as image quality went, back in the day, back in the early 2000s. So maybe they just had the foresight to add a different de-interlacing method when put into game mode. And there's nothing stopping any current manufacturer from doing that for not much more money. I just think the issue is there's not much 480i gaming. You'd really have to only be using PS2, GameCube, and maybe Xbox One, but most of those, meaning the original Xbox, but most of those Xbox games are at least 480p compatible. So I actually think that you'd find it to be way more common that you would have 240p than 480i these days, at least from games. So that's an interesting one. I'd hold on to it just for the hell of it if you have the space for it. If you live in a glorified closet like I do, I don't know, maybe put it up on the forums and see if anybody else wants it for a reasonable price, of course. You're not going to get $1,000 for that, but it's certainly not free. So I don't know, that's an interesting one. Does anybody have any thoughts or experience with the flat screen TVs that have very low lag on interlaced? Next, Cesar Montez wanted to know how to check a repro cart for like 3.3 versus 5 volt and stuff like that. And Rene's article, his very long article from back in the day, kind of shows you how to do that. You'd have to identify components and kind of read the writing on them and go look up the spec sheets. I don't know that you'd be able to check with a multimeter because you're still running at the voltage of the console. So I think you would still show the voltage that the console outputs no matter what. So I would just kind of go back through that article and see. But while Rene's article was 100% true in really trying to get people to have better design practices, I think, at least in my own opinion, voltage isn't going to be as much of a problem for scenarios like this as beveled edge carts. So if you look at the edge of, very carefully, like if you look right at the edge of one of these cartridges, you'll see that it's not a square. It's kind of, flat on the top and it's beveled on the sides. And I think that would actually cause more damage if you leave it just flat. Because what you're essentially doing is slamming into the cartridge connector every time you're inserting it. Whereas the beveled edge is what kind of pushes the pins out in a safer way. So I think for long-term use, that might actually be more damaging. Because the short version is, in a scenario like that, whenever you run something out of spec, it's never good, but you're probably going to burn out the cartridge long before the console in that scenario. There's a very few exceptions. Unmodified 161-in-1 Neo Geo carts are iffy. The 100-in-1 NES carts you get from China, those are the worst. Those are just straight up, don't even put them near your Nintendo. But just a repro running off voltage isn't the worst thing in the world. So, if you have an Earthbound cartridge that you really like, I would try to check out the components, check the beveled edge. And nowadays, though, with Voltar's 16-bitter and super stacker boards, or whatever he's calling them, and the Real Phoenix has a couple of adapter boards, it's not unfeasible for somebody who's got just basic skills to redo your repro or buy a different, like the Japanese Earthbound, and do the English translation or something. And then you're using original cartridges or the original circuitry. So I would check it out, and if you're uncomfortable about it, then maybe just look into making another one. And if anybody is into making these for other people, that's when you really need to stick with the specs. Because the bottom line is, if you're making one for yourself, maybe you're going to shorten the life of the console or cart, maybe not. But if you're making these to sell to other people, it's really disingenuous to sell something that might not be perfect when the cost of it is, in a run of 100, it's like $1 difference to get different parts on there. Maybe I'm a little bit off, but still, the point is, if you're making it for yourself, it's good practice. Try to get the beveled edge. But if you're making anything for other people, then I would really be more stringent on the parts that you used and how close it came to, the official specs. Next up, Martin Lowe has a question that I'm about to tackle myself, in fact. He said that he likes the idea of adding the Genesis 2 AV port to the back of a Genesis 1 in place of the RF jack. Fits perfectly, looks cool. The only downside is the Japanese Mega Drives don't have an RF output. It only has the AV1. So I have a Japanese Mega Drive sitting here, and we were just debating the same thing. We meaning the Triple Bypass team, and most specifically Jose, the person who I trust to do all of anytime I do a mod like this first, I go through him because the skill level is way past mine. And that's kind of what we're debating now. Do we just leave it the way it was and have line output in the front? That's what a lot of people prefer because they already bought the cables for it and everything, at least for the Mega Drives, the Japanese ones without the RF. My idea was to remove the Genesis 1 mini DIN, or the full-size DIN, scrape up the board and solder in the Model 2 exactly where it was, but then you just have to make absolutely sure that no signal is going to any of those pins at all. And for a video, that's super easy. You just remove the components going between the CXA and the mini DIN, and then lift whatever legs on the RGB legs on the CXA just to be sure. So for the video signals, it's super easy to make sure there's no signals going. But 5 volts is the thing that would really scare me, because essentially, if you do this wrong, you're going to be touching 5 volts to ground, and you'll short the thing out the moment you plug it in. So that, making sure that none of the connections are there, most importantly 5 volt, is what you'd really have to worry about. And then after that, I'm pretty sure you could just scrape the board the same way we normally would, just solder it upside down that way. The other thing you could do, which I don't recommend, but you could rewire the Genesis DIN that's already in there and then make your own adapter cable. So like the Genesis 1 to Genesis 2 adapter, you could do that. But the problem I have with all of this is this all makes sense today, right now. But what happens when that console goes to someone else and they just plug in a Genesis 1 DIN and something doesn't work? So that's the only reason I don't like to do stuff like that. But if you'd like to wait, just follow me on Twitter. I know it's annoying. Most of us don't like to deal with social media. But follow me on Twitter. Follow Jose on Twitter if you want immediate results. If not, I will absolutely talk about it when we do it. But I think Jose and I are going to try exactly that and see how it works with this setup. We've had some weird issues where sometimes we'll have 4 exact motherboard revision Model 1s, and they'll react differently after doing the triple bypass. So I want to make sure that we go through pretty thoroughly before posting any info on the website, or maybe the wiki will be up by then. But I have no problem just saying, hey, look at this experiment we're doing. Don't try this at home, and throwing something up on Twitter. So maybe follow us and see, but or if you just want to try it yourself, go for it. I mean, as long as you're sure that 5 volts is no longer going to those pads at all, then you should be good to go. But that's an interesting one, and that's a scenario that I'm still kind of grappling with. And I think most people would just prefer to use the front headphone jack just because they don't have to do any of the extra work. But that's going to be up to you. Fabian Kramer has a couple of questions that I've answered before in the Q&A, but I'm always happy to re-answer them. He'll be in New York for the first time and wanted to know what are the good spots to go to. So depending where you're going to be, if you're in Manhattan, the thing that I usually like to do is start at the Nintendo store. I brought a ton of people there. No one's bought anything, but everybody was glad that they went. It's just like a neat little experience. And who knows, maybe you'll end up with a sweatshirt or something. Definitely check out upstairs in the Nintendo store, though. It's cooler than the downstairs. And then if you like walking, I do. I know I don't look like it, but I certainly do. Walked all the way down to J&L and check out their stuff. And they're very strange with their prices. Anybody in New York who's listening to this is already rolling their eyes, but I enjoy going. You might see something in a good price range that you might like. And then go down to Video Games New York, and that place is awesome. And that place is still, I'm still not sure how I feel about the prices, because you can get a ton of stuff super cheap and super fairly priced, but then you'll see one thing oddly priced way more expensive than the rest. So, it's pretty obvious if you're already watching this channel, then it's going to be obvious to you which stuff is a great deal and which stuff is probably just there on display that they threw a price tag on. But I really like that place. I like the whole crew over there, and they have a lot of really neat stuff. Like they have a PlayStation dev unit. It's all behind glass, but if you're a hardware nerd, you would really enjoy that place. And then if you have time, head out to Brooklyn Video Games. Now that would normally be the first place I tell you to go, except if you're in Manhattan, it could be an hour away. But it's a smaller store, it's very New York style. I mean, you got to make do with the small space we have out here. But that's where everything's different. Everything's fairly priced. They're the only game store I've ever seen with a full RGB setup. If you happen to be in town for any one of the tournaments, especially if you like the game King of Fighters, plan around that and just go. It's a very cool place to hang out at, and everybody's friendly. Especially if you go for the tournament, just say, hey, you saw the tournament, wanted to check the place out. Everybody's very welcoming. So, those are the things to go to. If you're not going to be close to Brooklyn your entire time, I understand if you don't go, because that is quite a journey just for one stop. But heck, maybe try looking up other stuff around there. Maybe check out Coney Island and see if that's your thing. You could definitely make that part of the trip as well. But please message me if you're around. I always tell everybody, message me when you're in New York, but please just understand that I really do work all day long. And I'm not saying that to ask for your sympathy, oh, Bob works so hard. It's absolutely not at all what I mean. I just mean if you message me and say, hey, are you around tonight or tomorrow, and I say no, it's no disrespect. The chances are I probably have stuff planned. So you're saying next week? I already know there's 3 days next week that I'll be completely booked solid, either doing a project or having to be away somewhere working on something. But anybody that's in the New York area, definitely feel free to just message me, because worst comes to worst, I'm not around. But if I am, I always love meeting everybody, hanging out, having a drink. And for the record, drink could be beer, coffee, water. I don't really give a shit. It's just the term I like to use, I guess. But enjoy New York, enjoy all the sights, and if I forgot anything that people think that you should see while you're out here, please post down below. I think I nailed everything retro gaming related, but we'll see. You can also hit up the barcades, but that's really more just like a bunch of arcades that sort of work around beer. It's not really focused on the arcade experience, but I still enjoy them just for different reasons. Jeremiah Jackson just ran into a problem that I just had the same exact thing happen. He tried to install a Game Gear TV outboard, but in attempting to pre-wire everything, he accidentally lifted some of the smaller components from the board. He can get another Game Gear and recap it, but he's not able to perform the RGB mod. Do I know anybody who you could send it to? Yeah, I mean, depending on, well, first, to directly answer your question, depending on where you are, I would recommend different people. If you're in the New York area, Jose or iFix Retro would be able to do it. If you're in the UK, Video Game Perfections guy is really good. And then there's just around the world, there's all different people that are kind of known to do great modding work. Anybody from Leon to Mobius to, I mean, there's a long list of awesome people out there. So maybe just message me where you're at, or maybe just kind of Google some of these people and see if there's somebody close to you. But what happened to you is exactly why I recommend, your exact scenario. Try it yourself, see what you could do, but expect to have to fall back on a professional. And I just had this the other day when we were recapping the TV. I lifted a component, I was using a bad set of cutters, and because Jose was sitting right next to me, I just went, hey, I screwed this up, and he fixed it, and put it right back. So without that, it would have made it a nightmare. I would have had the TV completely in a million pieces. I would have had to bring the board to him, and so that's just a reminder that when you do these things, there's a reason that I always recommend just going to a pro, because if everything falls into place, a lot of this stuff isn't very hard. But what you do when something goes wrong is always a big deal, and the only way to know that is experience. So I certainly feel your pain. I've been there, and to be honest, most pros could probably repair the Game Gear that you have fairly easily. I mean, unless you tore the components and the traces off completely, then maybe you could just use that for parts. But if it really is just something like you lifted a component and you pulled the trace up and they're still hanging there, they could all fix that, so you wouldn't need to go to a new Game Gear. But yeah, I would just kind of Google whoever's closest to you. Always Google their name and see what comes up. If it's somebody with a history of doing good mod work, then you should be good. Anybody that's eager to send pictures of their mod work is generally a sign that they're proud of their work. Anybody that refuses to send you pictures of their mod work is probably somebody you don't want to hire. Within reason. Don't ask for 100 pictures, but if you say, hey, have you ever done a Game Gear before? Have you ever fixed a broken trace? And somebody comes back with a picture of a recapped and TV modded Game Gear, you could probably be, more confident that they're going to do good work. But yeah, I feel your pain. It sucks when you lift stuff off and you break components, but most of it is fixable, so you should be okay. Phil Welker asked if I was aware of any open source RGB to composite encoders. No, and even if you meant component, that's no either. If you're willing to work on one, that would be really great. I know there's chips out there that should be able to do it. I don't know anybody that's looked into RGB to composite, though. I think there's some Extron devices that might be able to do it that add like 1 frame of lag or something. And that's an interesting use case. I wonder why you would want that. Maybe RGB from a console to a capture card, but then split to composite for a consumer grade TV or something. That's kind of an interesting use case. If you're willing to post why you need that, I might be able to help out with alternative methods, because there's a bunch of stuff I've been working on, like the live demo I've been doing. One console, all of the outputs. So you see the RF, composite, S-video, and RGB output from a Super Nintendo. And I have a special thing that I made in order to do that. So to answer your direct question, no, but please, if you don't mind, explain the whole thing. I might be able to help out a different way. And if you do end up doing this, please open source and share. I don't know why, but I'm sure somebody would want to use this. Chris from Belgium had a great question. He wants to know my opinion on replacement shells. So I've made it very clear that I hate cutting original plastic from consoles. It's rare that I'd be willing to do it. I think the Dreamcast HDMI is the first one of my own consoles that I'm happy to do that on, just because it's such a ridiculously good upgrade. You don't need to cut the N64 anymore, thanks to Greg, so you could just now you could put his 3D printed thing in and use the Ultra HDMI with no cut. But generally speaking, what I've seen over the years is people cutting for mods that they think are awesome. I saw some in like early 2000s, like some Master Systems that have AV out and S video drilled into the back. And while it was really nicely done and it looks stock, it's useless now. So now you just have all these holes in the back of your console. And so the opposite side of those, the replacement shells, I love the thought of modifying those. And if they were easier to purchase and more readily available, I mean, to be honest, I think I'd buy a couple of SNES ones just to do exactly what I mocked. I would have composite S video and everything in the back just so I could have one test unit with all the outputs. So I love replacement shells. The only ones that I may or may not cut are the clear ones, because I'm a nerd. I want to see the insides of the plastic as well, or the insides, not just the plastic. But yeah, I think not only do I love the replacement shells, I love the fact that I could cut them up and not feel guilty. I know when I was looking into getting a Wii Dual, I wanted the clear shell so that I could cut for the HDMI port, and then I was just going to leave the original white one just sitting in a box for who knows what. I mean, maybe I'll always leave that clear shell on and love it, or maybe 10 years from now, there'll be an 8K version that doesn't require cutting that I could put the original case back on. Who knows? Point is, I have that option now that I would have bought the extra case. Whereas if you cut an original case, that option's gone. So yes, love replacement shells, love hacking them up to do different mods, and I just wish they were more readily available. Patton Thompson had an interesting question. He said he has a 32-inch Trinitron and a 20-inch PVM, and he's thinking of recapping them. The Trinitron is over 200 caps. Is it really worth it to replace every single electrolytic cap? Are there yield areas that would improve the geometry? That's the main thing he wants to improve. So this is kind of an interesting question, and it's something that I'm battling with at the moment, and I'll even have a video on this relatively soon, because we just recapped that JVC consumer grade TV that had almost 200 caps in it, I think, maybe a little less. So to directly answer your question, if you're going to be RGB modding an original TV and not using any of the inputs, you could skip any of the components that are around most of those input areas and just focus on the power boards and stuff like that. But if you're doing a full recap and you use good quality capacitors, you'll probably never have to recap it again, unless you leave it on 24/7. But if you just use it while you're playing, that might be the last time you ever have to touch it. Even if the caps start to dry out, 10 years, 15 years from now, maybe you could go back and redo some of the power caps. But it's a question I'm really struggling with. Pat, the BVM technician, says no. He said he's had monitors that he's never replaced certain caps that still work fine, and more importantly, still check out on an ESR meter as perfectly fine. And he only replaces the capacitors that he knows goes bad consistently. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I'm not really sure what the correct answer is. Maybe the right answer with a consumer grade TV would be replace everything with really good quality caps. And then in the future, if something ever goes wrong, or if geometry gets off, then only replace whatever ones are bad. And at that point, maybe just check with an ESR meter. As far as the PVM goes, that's another one. I saw Jose do a full recap, every one of them on a 20-inch 20 M2U, and the difference when he was done blew me away. I mean, I look at RGB monitors every day. I have a 32-inch BVM D series, and when he turned this thing on after recapping all of it, I was in shock at how good it looked. Now, was that because was that because all of the caps were replaced, or was that because only the ones that were needed were replaced, and he could have only replaced 50 and not 250? I have no idea. So it's something I'm still looking into. I want to get it right. The only thing that I would ask as a favor is if you do any of these recaps, please do a full list. So you'll see on the board, it'll be like C125. You'll see the original capacitance and voltage. And then what I like to do is you have to do absolutely need the original capacitance, but I always bump up the voltage. The worst that could happen is nothing. The best that could happen is maybe if that cap was spec'd just right, now there's a little bit more percentage of wiggle room. I don't know. Certainly no bad would come of it as long as it could physically fit. So just do a cap list and maybe find one that when you do the replacement, measure out both the distance between the pins and then the height and width of the cap. Because there are a few that I got, when I did the cap list for this one with Danielle, we got one cap wrong that just luckily fit. I mean, it was definitely twice as wide as it should have been. A second cap we got way wrong. I mean, it was like 10 times the size, and luckily I had spares floating around. The ones that we missed were bipolar caps, so there's no mark on each side. You need to replace those with specific bipolar ones. And then there were a few that were just a little too big, but we just left a little more room on the legs. So instead of having it perfectly on the board, it was like a little askew to the side. Should be fine, not touching anything, but definitely keep those cap lists. And when the wiki goes up, what I'd asked is one of the first things we're able to do is make sure that there's a place to submit cap lists so that we could all keep them current. And maybe there'll even be spots so people could put DigiKey, Arrow, all the links that you would need for it. So you could just press a button and order a full cap list. That's the end goal for this stuff. And if it's a bigger named TV, like the 20M2U, there's a zillion of them out there. We could even talk to Luke from Console 5 and say, hey, we'd nail down the exact caps that you need. Can you put these into a cap kit? And that's what would really benefit everybody, because hopefully we could throw Luke a couple extra dollars for all his work. And you also get really high quality caps at bulk discounts, because Luke wouldn't buy enough for 2, he'd buy enough for 20, meaning, you get the bulk discount and now you're able to be honest, in that scenario with these big expensive caps, it would probably be cheaper to buy them from Console 5 than it would to do an order for one TV on DigiKey. So just please keep the cap list. If you do it, share it with us, and we could all end up benefiting from it. So hope that wasn't too much info. Hope I didn't just ramble on too much there for you. But good luck with all that. It's a lot of work, but if you do it right, it's a giant difference. Solid Unit has a bit of a complicated question, so I'm going to try my best to answer it. It looks like he's using a PC to an RGB monitor. Using RetroArch, and he's going from DisplayPort using an adapter to go to VGA with a custom-built sync combiner that goes from VGA to SCART. Obviously, you'd have to set the resolution to then 240p-ish. Then going into the G-SCART switch original, into a ShinyBow converter, into a consumer-grade component CRT. The two problems is, do I have any suggestions for fixing the auto sync? Because on the original G-SCARTs, if you leave it on port 8, and no other consoles are turned on, it just defaults to that. And if not, you need voltage on, I think it's on the voltage pin. I think you need this separate pin with voltage on it that detects it. I could be wrong because it's been a while since I've used the older one, but I think that's it. I think you just would need to run voltage. And then you're also saying that you're dropping signals sometimes on your Philips CRT. I think the chain might be part of this. And I think going from something like a mini DisplayPort to component video adapter might actually be a better choice for you, and just skipping the G-SCART switch. Maybe get the new G-Comp switch, and that way you could kind of have both going back and forth, because all of the components that you're talking about are well built. The ShinyBow converter, the G-SCART switch, DisplayPort to VGA adapters are a dime a dozen, so that's fine. But when you put them all together, there's always going to be something that gets weird. In the consumer grade TVs as well, if you're running original arcade resolutions, some will work and some won't. I've had TVs just not work at all when I use my RGB Pi and load up Mortal Kombat, because that's that weird refresh rate, weird resolution. So just for testing purposes, I would either try to find the DisplayPort to component adapter, or I guess a VGA to component adapter, and go directly into your TV and go from there, and maybe just try to back it up one at a time. I guess another thing you could do without buying anything would just go right from your custom SCART cable to the ShinyBow converter and then see if that drops signal. But I would just kind of back it off to see if any one of these components are something that would cause the issue. And there was somebody talking about, it's probably a year away, but making a direct converter to go from digital to SCART. So who knows, maybe that'll be out soon enough. But I think I would, if I were you, I would definitely just start removing components in the middle and kind of see if you could nail down which one's causing the sync drop, or if it's just your Philips CRT directly. Well, that's it for this week. I think I'm finishing up right about the time that construction's starting to go nuts outside, so this was well timed, I guess. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for everybody who participates in these things. I really enjoy doing them, and it's a small little way of trying to give back to everybody who supports. And if you're new to all this, please just post your question wherever the latest Q&A video is on any of the support platforms. I turn off comments on YouTube, even though I kind of make it public about a month later just as a courtesy. This really is focused on thanking all of you. So I try to just stick to commenting in the support platforms. So wherever it is that you support, whatever's easiest for you, I don't care which, just make sure to ask your question in the latest video there. And I can't really go back and sort through the other ones, kind of the way I do things. So thank you so much for all your support, and I'll see you next week.